Got a bit of a cold, so you have to excuse me if I croak a bit and possibly have to step away from the microphone to blow my nose at some point. I thought I'd spare you the radio mic. Okay, so as many of you will know, Herman Kaplan and Josh Deaver have just published a book called The Inessential Indexical, in which they argue that the whole idea of the essential indexical and the idea that the first-person perspective has some special philosophical role is all a big myth. I don't agree with the big picture statement there. I do think there is something special about thoughts that get expressed using indexicals. I do think that there's a clear notion of the first-person perspective that is very important. But at the same time, I do actually agree with quite a lot of what Herman and Josh say. I think that quite often the reasons why indexicals are essential have been misdiagnosed. At any rate, I'm going to try to put forward an explanation of what it is for indexicals to be essential and exactly why they are. This isn't going to be a reply to Kaplan and Deaver, except just in that I'm putting forward a doctrine that they don't think exists. So I'm going to construe this in terms of actions. I'm going to argue that there's a certain class of indexicals that are essential for a certain class of actions. So I construe the doctrine of the essential indexical as having something to do with action and therefore as being essentially a matter of issues in philosophy of mind rather than philosophy of language. I'm not going to claim that there's anything essential about indexicals linguistically, or if there is, that's going to be an independent claim from the one that I'm going to make. So very, very brief statement of what I'm going to say is that indexicals of a certain kind are essential for actions of a certain kind because those indexicals connote certain mental states that have a unique epistemic role. And that derives from the fact that those mental states represent relations in which the thinking subject or the experiencing subject is one of the relata. I'm going to claim that that puts the thinker in a special epistemic situation, which is essential for certain kinds of actions. I take that to be different from what a lot of people are saying because it's not a claim about semantics, it's not a claim about a special kind of content or anything like that. It's a claim about an epistemic property that certain mental representations have. So here very roughly is what I'm going to be arguing for. As Kaplan and Deaver say, it's not always completely clear what people mean when they talk about essential indexicals, and perhaps different people have meant slightly different things, but I think that what I'm going to argue for more or less captures the spirit of what most people have had in mind by this claim that indexicals are essential. So the claim is that there's a certain class of actions, call that CA, such that no action in CA can be performed by an agent who lacks the relevant egocentric mental state, the presence of which is normally indicated by the use of an egocentric indexical. So I'll have to explain what a number of those things mean. First of all, this class of actions CA, it might include absolutely all possible actions, but well, I'll say a bit more about that later on. But it at least includes a quite significant class of the kinds of actions that are performed by human beings. Actions that we perform using our bodies in relation to our environment in ways that depend on the relations that we stand in to our environment. I will say a few things to try to argue that actually the claim will include all actions. I think Michael's going to say something about that in his comments afterwards. I've limited this to egocentric indexicals, by which I mean, roughly speaking, I, here, and now. I'm not going to give you a definition of egocentric indexicals. It's going to become apparent from what I'm saying which ones they are. Actually, when I was thinking about this yesterday, I realized that, in fact, I think the class of indexicals this applies to will be rather broader than what I'm saying here. But I won't complicate matters for now. When I talk about egocentric mental states, That's a certain kind of mental state whose presence is indicated by the use of an egocentric indexical, but not actually expressed by utterances containing these indexicals. And so now I'll explain what I mean by that. So there are going to be a number of steps to this, and I'll try to convince you of each point, and then the really crucial point will come towards the end. So first of all, I want to tell you about a thing that I call the connotation principle. I'm using the word connotation in just a sort of everyday, non-technical sense here. So the connotation principle says that when a subject S uses an egocentric indexical term lambda in referring to an object O, by object I mean that very broadly. It can include both physical objects but also places, times, persons, anything. So when a subject S uses an egocentric indexical term lambda in referring to an object O, S's use of lambda indicates that S believes that S stands in an SE relation to O. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Different indexicals connote different SE relations. So an SE relation is a subject-environment relation. It's a relation that the thinking subject stands in to the thing that's being thought about. Important that these are relations between the thinking subject and the reference. So in particular, the relations I'm talking about are not relations between linguistic tokens and the thing that's being thought about. I take it that the relation between a linguistic token and the reference in itself is never going to be important for the kinds of actions that one can perform. It's important only in that it tells us something about the relation between the thinking subject and whatever it is that's being thought about. For those of you who know about Arthur Pryor's "thank goodness that's over" argument, I think that's one lesson we can take from that argument. Also, the connotation principle doesn't just apply to actual utterances. It applies to the state of mind of somebody who would use an indexical in expressing their thoughts if they were to make an utterance. So I'll go through some examples of what I mean by these SE relations. The easy case is the spatial ones. So suppose that S believes that it is F here about some location L. Well, then the very fact that S has chosen to use the word here rather than some other word in expressing the thought shows that S also believes that L is hereabouts, where what it is for a place to be hereabouts is for it to be where S is located. But it may be that S's thought about hereabouts would have a monadic form. Notoriously, words like near, far, to the left can have monadic form, even though the truth conditions will involve the subject. Again, I'm going to say more about this. Arguably, words like there and also that don't connote any particular SE relations. Very often it will be the case that somebody who expresses their thought using a word like this nevertheless does take themselves to stand in some sort of SE relation. So when I say there's a black box there, well, as a matter of fact, I can see the black box and I'm aware of a certain sort of relation that I stand in to that box. But there might also be cases in which I'm not aware of an SE relation, like when I hear a voice and maybe I can think about that person, but maybe I can't actually tell where the sound is coming from. So in that case, I'm not really aware of my relations to the person who's making the sound. But I take it that there are certain indexicals, like I and here and now, that do actually, their very use connotes the fact that the subject takes themselves to stand in one of these relations to the reference. The temporal case is just a little bit trickier. In itself, the claim is simple, that if S believes that it is F now about some time t, then S also believes that t is present. I think that would be hard to deny. Doesn't seem that it would be coherent to say it's 3 o'clock now, but 3 o'clock is not present. That doesn't seem like something someone could believe. So somebody who uses the word now when talking about 3 o'clock believes that now is present. The complication comes from the fact that there's a big debate in the metaphysics of time over what presentness is. So A-theorists think that there's a real property of presentness, that there's an objective present, an objective past and future, and so on. B-theorists like me think that really time is a lot like space, there's no real objective present, and so presentness is really some kind of relation. But then it becomes a little bit difficult to say exactly which relation it is, because then it depends on what your view is about the persistence of persons. The problem being that I exist at many different times. I might be here at more than one time. So whereas in the case of here, you might think that here is reducible to the place where I am now, you can't reduce now to the time at which I am here, because I might be here at many different times. So we can't think of it as simply a relation that I stand in to a time, presentness. In my opinion, the most plausible story is the one you get from stage theory, which says that persons consist of a whole lot of stages, each existing at different times, and then presentness is a relation between a person's stage and a time. And so in that case, if t is present, then t is the same time at which this stage of me exists. But if you're an A-theorist and you think there's real presentness, then, well, you're going to have to tell a very different kind of story, and actually none of what I say is going to apply with regard to temporal indexicals then. I actually think that it's a lot harder to tell a satisfactory story about the importance of temporal indexicals for action if you are an A-theorist, but maybe that's a story for another day. It might seem slightly more surprising that I say there's also an SE relation connoted by personal indexicals like I. So I'm going to use iota for this. So if S believes that I am F about S, then S also believes that S is iota. That's the monadic form. So in fact, S's belief that S is iota is true if and only if S stands in the iota relation to S. So this iota relation is a subject-environment relation, a sort of limiting case. So what sort of relation is that then? Well, I used to think that it was going to be identity. The obvious relation in which I stand to myself is identity. But actually I don't think that's right. I think there are actually lots of other relations in which people stand to themselves. So here's an illustration. Here are two people, Smith and Jones. Any resemblance to Immanuel Kant really is of no significance at all. So suppose Smith and Jones are standing facing one another, and they both have a desire to raise Smith's arm. And let's suppose that both Smith and Jones can raise Smith's arm. This is sort of a John Perry example, actually, I think. But in order to raise Smith's arm, Smith and Jones must act in different ways because of the different relations that they stand in to Smith. So, for example, Smith stands in a relation to Smith such that Smith can raise Smith's arm at will, just by doing that. Jones does not stand in that relation to Smith. Jones cannot raise Smith's arm at will like that. If Jones wants to raise Smith's arm, Jones is going to have to do something like reaching out and lifting Smith's arm up. So there are these different relations that Smith and Jones stand in to Smith. Also, Smith receives information from Smith's body in certain ways that are not ways in which Jones receives information from Smith's body. So let's take all those kinds of relations, the ones that could be important for actions, together and just call their conjunction the iota relation. So Smith stands in the iota relation to Smith, but not to Jones. Jones stands in the iota relation to Jones, but not to Smith. Or maybe there are different iota relations for different people, reflecting their different capacities in relation to themselves, but for now I'll just simplify things and assume that there's just one iota relation. It might be helpful to think about the iota relation as an affordance relation, for those of you who know about that. It's a relation that has to do with one's capacities for action on one's environment and the capacities of the environment to act on one. And actually, I think that all of these SE relations really are more usefully thought about as affordance relations. So I've been talking about the spatio-temporal cases as though these are spatial relations or temporal relations, but actually I think there's a more general affordance relation that's more likely to be the SE relation. It's the one that, suppose we're thinking about near as an SE relation. So there's a sense in which what's near, an object can be near for a big person when it's a long way away, or it can be near in the same sense for a very small person when it's very close to that person, and it can be near in a completely different sense for a person who's embedded in a virtual reality computer environment. So it's a sort of functional relation. But anyway, I don't think that that's completely crucial to what I want to say. Now, these SE relations, I think, have a great importance for actions. If I'm going to use my body to act on my environment, then the way that I should act is going to depend on the SE relations that I stand into things. If I want to reach out and touch this black box, I have to reach out to my right, not to my left, for example. Don't miss this by using excessively coarse-grained action explanations. It is possible to give what will sound like a perfectly good explanation of an action in a very coarse-grained way, but that misses out all sorts of mental states that were involved. So, for example, I can say, I came to Donostia because I believed that the conference was here and I wanted to give a talk. And that seems like a perfectly satisfactory explanation of why I came here. But of course, if you think about all the things that were involved in my journey, there had to be a whole lot of other fine-grained mental states involved. So it's perfectly possible to say that, Simon wanted to touch the black box and believed that he could, so he did, or something like that, missing out any mention of SE relations. That wouldn't be sufficient to show that there weren't any SE relations involved. However, I must concede, it's not at all plausible that every fine-grained bodily movement is to be explained in terms of what somebody believes. If I reach out to grasp an object, the particular way in which I shake my fingers perhaps isn't very plausibly thought about as something that results from what I believe. But still, there seem to be plenty of cases in which it is going to be very, very plausible that SE relations are involved. Think about cases in which I have no perception of my environment, so my action is not being guided by perception. It's completely dark, I can't hear anything, I'm in sensory deprivation, but I believe that there's an object to my left and I want to touch the object, so I reach out to the left to touch the object. I think it's hard to avoid thinking that that came about because I believe the thing was to the left. This story can get a bit foggier though, and I suspect it might do when Michael gives his comments. For example, many of you will have heard about the Goodale and Milner two streams hypothesis. This is a view that perceptual processing takes place in two different streams in the brain, the dorsal and ventral streams. The ventral stream gives rise to conscious experience, but the dorsal stream guides action. And there's a certain amount of empirical evidence for this. One conspicuous case is a patient who had a certain kind of brain damage and who, if you showed her a letterbox slot, she really couldn't tell you which orientation it was in because she had an impairment to her ability to recognize shapes. But if you gave her a letter to post through it, surprisingly, she would orient the letter in exactly the right way and post it through the slot. So this is sometimes taken to show that one's conscious experience has nothing much to do with guiding one's action, You might think it's possible to raise some objection based on this to the idea that SE relations have a crucial role in producing actions. There's a number of things I can say in response to that. One is, for a start, the worst case scenario for me here would be to say that, well, there are mental representations of SE relations, but they're all in the dorsal stream. They're at a subpersonal level. Maybe I'm not aware of them, but they're still doing the job, and actually the things that I want to say could still be true. But I think it's not very plausible that we should draw quite such a strong conclusion from the Goodale and Milner hypothesis. It seems very clear that conscious experience does tell us about whether things are to the left, to the right, near, far, and so on. Also tells us whether they're happening now, that kind of thing. And, okay, it may be that conscious experience is not what's guiding the fine-grained details of bodily movements, but that doesn't show that conscious experience is not informing one of all kinds of things that one needs to be informed of in order to make decisions about which action to deliberately perform. So perhaps the role of conscious experience is to tell me how I could act. Could I reach out and touch that black box without moving my feet? Well, no. I can tell you that based on the conscious experience I have of the black box right now. So if I wanted to touch the box but couldn't move my feet, I wouldn't even try to reach out and touch. I do think it's important to remember, incidentally, that actions are things we do deliberately, intentionally. In order to do that, one has to have some idea of how one could act and how one could go about acting. So one way to bring this out is by thinking about Lewis's example of the two gods. Most of you are probably familiar with this. Lewis invites us to imagine a world in which there are two gods, but they're spatio-temporally located gods. They live in different places in the world. They have different characteristics. And they're propositionally omniscient. They know all the true propositions, and so they know exactly which possible world they're in, but they don't have any beliefs that they could express using indexicals. And it's very tempting to think that this somehow gets in the way of their acting on that world. And I think that that's right. But now, it's not that they literally can't act. They're not paralyzed. Suppose that each of the gods was stood a few meters from a small, rather precarious table with a glass of water, and they had a malicious desire to knock the glass of water over. One way they could do that would be to just thrash around at random, produce random movements, and eventually the glass of water will probably get knocked over. And in fact, if there's no time limit on the action, they could do all sorts of things in this way. Just by producing random motor movements, all sorts of things would happen. Maybe a script for Hamlet would get written eventually. But that's not really action. Action, as we would normally construe it, seems to involve having some idea of how one's going to do what one will do. At any rate, what Lewis's two gods seem to lack is the kind of knowledge that would enable them to act in a directed way, not just randomly thrashing about. I'll digress just very briefly here to talk about the question of whether the claim I want to make applies to all actions rather than just the actions of creatures like human beings that use their bodies to act on their spatio-temporal environment. It's very tempting to think that there could be some other sort of godlike creature who can act just by thinking about what state of affairs should come about. So maybe Lewis's two gods would have some kind of representation of their worlds, some sort of mental representation. But it's a non-indexical one, so maybe they have names for all of the objects in that world and words for all of the properties and so on. And it's tempting to think, well, maybe there could in principle be a sort of godlike creature who acts just by specifying how the world should be. Just gives out something like chess moves, knight moves to king's pawn. They just specify something like that, and it just happens. Does that mean that a god like that, who performs these godlike actions, would not require any awareness of that god's relations to the different objects in the environment. Well, this is tentative, but I think maybe it doesn't. Suppose that you were to try to act in that way. Put yourself in the position of one of those gods who has this non-indexical representation of the world. You must at least take it that, suppose what they do is they utter the words, A moves to X, and then lo and behold, object A moves to X. Unless you took it that uttering those words would produce that movement, then you wouldn't know how to act. You could do the sort of random thrashing about thing by just producing various random sentences, but if you want object A to move and you want to do it deliberately, you've got to know how to make that happen. In which case it seems that you must be aware that you stand in a relation to that object such that if you produce a certain vocalization, that object will move in a certain way. So although we're now quite far removed from spatio-temporal relations, there is a kind of very abstract functional relation that this godlike creature must still be aware of standing into the different objects in order to be able to move them deliberately. But in any case, if that's wrong, well, then I'll just restrict my claim to the kinds of actions that humans perform rather than to all kinds of actions. Now, none of this will get you essential indexicality so far. What we need for essential indexicality, according to me, is a notion that is related to the notion of an unarticulated constituent, but it's not the same notion. We actually need a thing that I'll call first-person redundancy, which is an epistemic property. I'm not completely clear in my mind how it stands in relation to the notion of an unarticulated constituent, but we'll get to that. So, unarticulated constituents, it's already been talked about in several talks, so I'll be quick about this. John Perry introduced us to this notion. One of his examples was that under some circumstances a creature could just say it is raining, and that can be true if and only if it's raining at location L at time t. And L and T would then be unarticulated constituents. And John, along with subsequently various other people like John Campbell, Sidney Shoemaker, a number of people have claimed that in some cases the thinking subject can be an unarticulated constituent of that subject's own thoughts and experiences. And that's what happens when you have a monadic use of here or there or to the left and so on. Well, that's clear enough for language. We know how we can tell if there's an unarticulated constituent in language because we can look at the syntax and we can see how many argument places there are, and then we can look at the truth conditions and see how many argument places there are in there, and if there are less in the syntax than in the truth condition, it seems we have some unarticulated constituents. But can we say the same thing for thought and experience? For thought, maybe if there's a language of thought, you could do the same thing syntactically, but certainly it doesn't seem that experience has the same type of structure. It doesn't plausibly have any kind of linguistic structure to it that would serve that purpose of syntax to tell us about the presence of unarticulated constituents. Now, there may well be a way to fix this. All I'm going to do right now is just say that it's rather plausible that there are such things. So what I have in mind is this. Look at that scene and pretend it's just a scene that you're looking at rather than an image on a screen. So you see a person S standing in front of a tree, and you'd be warranted in judging there is a tree in front of S. Could turn out that S is you if there's some sort of illusion here where there's a reflection or a refraction or whatever. Alternatively, look at this scene. Well, that seems to warrant you in judging that there's a tree in front, the monadic form. Perhaps that that experience then warrants you in judging there's a tree in front of me. But I think there is a certain plausibility to the claim that the content of the experience is better captured with the abbreviated "there is a tree in front," because the subject doesn't need to be represented visually. You might see yourself, bits of yourself in peripheral vision, but things look to the left or near or far in just the same way, whether or not you could see yourself. If you were invisible, they'd still look that way. So I think there's a lot of plausibility to the idea that the experiencing subject is not represented in experience. You might think of that as an unarticulated constituent in the content of experience. But anyway, what I need is not that notion, but a related one that I'm calling first-person redundancy. So imagine that we have a one-dimensional world. It just consists of a line, and there's some creature S who lives in this world and who eats certain objects like A's and B's that also are situated along that line. Well, S is in a position to represent the locations of A and B relative to S just using a single parameter, just a number, distance along the line, plus so much, minus so much. So if S takes S's self to be at 0, then A is at -2, B is at +1. And in order for S to act on A or B, S only needs to make use of that single distance parameter. So S doesn't need representations like A is -2 units from me, or B is +1 unit from me. So in those sort of cases, a representation of S would be redundant. It wouldn't be doing any work. It doesn't matter whether S can see S or not, can perceive S or not. It's the number of parameters that S is sensitive to in acting on A and B is just this one parameter. So suppose S eats A's and B's and needs to perform a catch action like sticking its tongue out whenever an object is exactly 1 unit away. Well, it just waits until the distance parameter falls to 1 unit and then performs the action. Okay, that's just repeating. So this is what I call first-person redundancy. It's a kind of epistemic shortcut. It happens when the subject's responsive to just one parameter in dealing what is actually a two-place subject-environment relation, or more generally sensitive to n-1 parameters for any n-place relation involving a subject. So it makes no difference whether the subject's explicitly represented or not. I've said all this. So, when you are one of the relata in an SE relation, you can take advantage of this sort of epistemic shortcut. If someone else wanted subject S to act in a certain way in relation to objects A or B, they'd need two things. They'd need the position of S and the position of A, say, and then figure out from that what the distance between them was. But when you are S, you don't need to do all that. You can take this shortcut. I'm going to argue that this feature of first-person redundancy is the crucial thing that makes the egocentric indexicals essential for action. So essentiality arises from an epistemic property, not from any special kind of content. I'm going to argue for this using a kind of regress argument. So suppose we have a subject S who stands in an SE relation R1 to some object O. And S wishes to perform an action on O that depends on S standing in R1 to O. So like reaching out and touching. So suppose that S only had the fully articulated kind of mental representation. Something that was not first-person redundant. I'm going to assume this in order to show that actually there must be some first-person redundant representation as well. So S has got a representation in this form. R1 brackets SO means S stands in R1 to O. So this would be like a situation in which you see a person S and you see an object O, and you want S to reach out and touch O. And by definition, since this representation of the relation between S and O is not first-person redundant, you can't take these epistemic shortcuts. So what you'd have to do in that situation is, well, what you would do is you'd somehow make S act on O. But how would you do that? Somehow you've got to make S do something. But in order to do that, you yourself are acting on S. All of this is true if S is not you, and it's really just going to be the same, even if as a matter of fact S is you because you're looking at a reflection in a mirror or something like that. So you have to act on S, but in order to do that, then you're going to need to know about your SE relation to S. There's going to be some other SE relation, R2, between S and S, assuming that S is you. Now suppose that your representation of that SE relation is also not first-person redundant. So you have S stands in R2 to S. In this case, R2 is going to be one of these things I called an iota relation, an action-relevant relation one stands into oneself. Well, you can see how this is going to go. If this is not first-person redundant, then we're just going to keep iterating the same thing. We're going to go off on an infinite regress. You've got to know now how to make S act on S in a certain way. Well, in order to know how to make S act on S in a certain way, you're going to need to know certain things about your relation to S, some other relation you stand into S, and this is just going to go on forever. So we have an infinite regress. Seems like the only way that that regress could be stopped is by having a representation of an SE relation that is first-person redundant. So to put the idea behind this into a slogan, the thought is that when I act, in the normal case, I just act. I don't normally make myself act by acting on myself, treating myself as an object and making myself do something. Or in the very rare cases in which I do that, so maybe I'm paralyzed with fear and I have to sort of make myself put one foot in front of the other very consciously instead of just walking. In the very rare cases in which I do make myself act, I just do that. I don't make myself act. Clearly there's an infinite regress there. A lot of people have noted that there are potentially infinite regresses about the self a little bit like this. Gilbert Ryle talks about one a little bit like this, but nothing in terms of content. So this is just a diagram to illustrate the same thing. So the arrows point towards the object of the action. So the thought is, if S wants to act on O, then S needs the representation that S stands in R1 to O. But then in order to act on the basis of that representation, S would have to act on S, which would require a representation that S stands in R2 to S. And the only way it's going to stop is if at some point there's a representation of a relation that's first-person redundant. And I've drawn that as just having one parameter in it. In the normal case, of course, none of this would happen. It would just stop at the first stage. S would just have a representation that would be of the form R1 brackets O, using that notation. So I think we have here an explanation for why there is a certain kind of mental representation that is at least indicated by the use of a certain kind of indexical, without which actions, or at least a certain class of actions, would be impossible. So putting it all together, we get this picture. There's a certain class of indexicals, the egocentric indexicals, that connote these mental states that I'm calling egocentric mental states. And those egocentric mental states have a representational content that is, they represent SE relations. That just comes from the connotation principle. And in order for many types of action to be possible, the subject must possess a mental representation of an SE relation, and that mental representation has to be first-person redundant in order to do its job. So, consequently, the mental representations whose presence is manifested or indicated by the use of egocentric indexicals are essential for action. So I've just rewritten the doctrine of the essential indexical that I started with, to say there is a class of action CA such that no action in CA can be performed by an agent who lacks a first-person redundant mental state of the kind normally indicated by the use of an egocentric indexical. That's the story. Thank you.